Bushey, Hertfordshire, is a quaint little town just on the outside of southeast London, England. The main high street is lined with small little homes with walls painted a startling pure white and front doors covered in a multitude of cheerful hues. Often when people are asked to imagine a typical historic British town, an image that springs to mind is likely to be similar to Bushey. It's the perfect location for families looking to escape the hubbub of the cosmopolitan capital, but it is still close enough so that all of the major London hotspots are only a short train ride away. It's a quiet place with a long history spanning all the way back to the Domesday Book of 1086, but recent archaeological discoveries may take the town back even further through the ages to the Paleolithic period. There are many things to see and do in Bushey, including the annual Bushey Festival or the quarter marathon run by thousands every summer to raise money for charities such as the local Peace Hospice, the nearby world-famous Elstree Film Studios where such movies as The Shining, Aliens and Lucky Jim were filmed, thus making the town a haven for film fans just as much as it is a haven for those looking for a little piece of England to call their own and raise a family. Overall, Bushey seems like a truly perfect place to live. However, like most seemingly ordinary and quiet English towns, there can be much darker things lurking behind those pretty multicoloured doors lining those quaint streets. One of the darker sides to small-town British life came to light in the heinous events that unfolded around the 23rd of January 2022. It was a case that didn't just shock and disgust the county of rural Hertfordshire, but the whole of the country. This is a truly criminal podcast exclusive. This is the case of the Honey Trap murder. Vishal Gohel was born in India in 1978 and immigrated to the United Kingdom with his family when he was still relatively young. The Gohel family quickly settled into their new home in rural Hertfordshire. After buying and selling real estate, the family was comfortable with money, and Vishal was raised in an upper-middle-class home. As he grew into adulthood, he had many friends and became popular for his easygoing nature and his humour in particular. His aunt Bonnie would later describe him as charming, intelligent, handsome and driven. He had a wicked sense of humour, would bring us to side-aching laughter with his impressions and storytelling. However, by 2022, divorced and feeling extremely isolated because of the lockdown and social distancing measures in place in England due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the father of 2 young boys was going to extreme measures to find some kind of comfort and female companionship. After giving up on dating apps, he was attempting to meet women underneath the pseudonym of Sam via the website Craigslist, which is primarily used as a place for people to buy and sell goods or offer services. He worked as an IT sales specialist, but had also built up a substantial amount of money through successfully speculating on the crypto markets, and would occasionally tell women he met online that he could be their sugar daddy. His best friend Rob told a journalist that he had won big with crypto, and his family did well in property, but he wasn't wealthy, just a bit flash. At 4:49 on the evening of the 21st of January 2022, Vishal received a message on Craigslist from a 22-year-old bank apprentice named Georgia Bruce Annan. The pair began chatting and the conversation quickly developed into that of a sexual nature. Vishal, still using the name Sam, told Georgia he had £67,000 in his bank account. Whether he said this as an attempt to impress her is unknown. However, what is known is that once she knew how much money the man she was talking to had, she put the wheels in motion to execute a despicable plan. They talked for hours that first night and continued flirting via text message into the following day of the 22nd of January. By the time they had said their virtual goodbyes, Vishal had agreed on being George's sugar daddy, and the 22-year-old had suggested bringing 2 of her female friends over to his house for a sex party that very night. This enticing promise of human contact and comfort at a time when the divorcee was at one of the lowest points in his life was too much for him to pass up on. And after telling Georgia he would pay her and her friends some cash as well as supply cocaine and marijuana, the 44-year-old gave her the address to his second-floor flat on Bushey High Street. Georgia didn't waste any time and began formulating a plan to rob the man she was now dubbing 67 after the amount of money he told her was in his bank account. The first person she contacted was Tevin Leslie, a 23-year-old bus driver with a violent streak from Brixton, South London. He was one of her friends and the pair occasionally had sex. Georgia knew the hot-headed and often violent man would be interested in her setup. The 2 constructed what they thought would be a foolproof plan to get their hands on the £67,000 that he had said was in his bank account. Tevin said he would invite his cousin, 22-year-old Sakeen Gordon, and their good friend, 23-year-old Brandon Brown, along to the robbery so that they could act as backup. Georgia said she knew 2 female friends who would be up for some free drugs and wouldn't mind robbing a lonely 44-year-old. Those friends were Faith Hoppy, who was also a friend of Brandon's, and the youngest of the gang, 20-year-old Soho sous chef, Tiana Edward Hancock. Blinded by the idea of getting their hands on his money, they spent most of the actual planning time bickering back and forth over the telephone about how the £67,000 should be split up amongst the group once they had it. On the evening of the 22nd of January at around 10:25 p.m, Vishal was captured on surveillance footage at his local convenience store. In the footage, he chats amicably with the cashier for a few minutes, and then can be seen purchasing alcohol, soft drinks, tobacco papers, and a pack of condoms. Earlier in the day, he had gone over to his mother's house to ask if he could borrow £100 for a couple of days, and in the CCTV footage, the 44-year-old can be seen withdrawing a further £100 from a cash point. Expecting a good-natured party with some possible sexual liaisons, he was evidently preparing for a fun night ahead. Tragically, he would be dead within hours. At around midnight, the 3 women, Georgia, Faith and Tiana, met up in the East London town of Barking, and then hailed a taxi, telling the driver to take them to Bushey High Street. Tiana would later testify that she had brought along a bag of sex toys. The taxi arrived in Bushey a little over an hour later and cost the women £42.75. It is unknown why the women decided to take a cab rather than the train, but it's believed they wanted to avoid being captured on CCTV. Despite these efforts, they were captured on surveillance footage multiple times throughout the following hours, and it was using these images that the Major Crimes Unit would later bring such a strong case against them. Now in Bushey, Georgia once again contacted Vishal to let him know they had arrived, and he helped direct them to the red bricked building on the corner of Melbourne Road and opposite Bushey County Club, where his second-floor flat was situated. The 3 women were let into his home, and according to Tiana's later statements, the 4 of them stood around in the kitchen doing drugs and chatting. She said that he had wanted Georgia to go and see him and bring her friends, saying he would buy drugs and they would party. She added that Vishal was funny and bubbly. I was very excited. He was quite charming. However, unbeknownst to him, as they were taking drugs from the kitchen countertop, both Georgia and Faith were in constant telephone contact with their male cohorts, texting Tevin and Brandon instructions and details of the property. Tevin had picked up the other 2 men in his Audi and then driven from London to Hertfordshire, arriving at 2:25 in the early hours of the 23rd. One of the women had then slipped out of the kitchen to unlock the front door for her 3 accomplices, who then burst into the flat and brutally began beating the unsuspecting man. He was gagged and severely beaten over the head. Coroner records would later describe the terrible ordeal that he had endured in his final agonising hour of life. The father of 2 had received such heavy blows to the head that he had suffered extreme brain damage. His voice box was fractured, which is consistent with injuries sustained through strangulation, and his body was badly bruised. 23-year-old Tevin would later testify that Vishal had attempted to fight the 3 men, but lost consciousness during the struggle. Vishal's best friend Rob disagreed that the father of 2 would have put up much of a fight in the face of such overwhelming odds. He told the media Vishal was by no means a fighter. He was a tiny guy for starters. He was street smart, so I think he would have given up anything he had willingly. With Vishal now dying at their feet and no way of gaining access to his bank accounts, the gang went through his pockets, stealing the £200 he had in his wallet. They then unclasped the smartwatch from his wrist, stole his iPhone, and wiped down the apartment surfaces in an attempt to erase fingerprints and any DNA evidence, whilst Vishal lay sprawled on the floor, duct tape over his mouth, breathing his last breaths. Seemingly content with their meagre haul, they quickly left the apartment and fled into the bitterly cold darkness of that January morning. It wouldn't be until many hours later when a next-door neighbour noticed his front door ajar and entered the flat to make sure he was okay. His body was discovered where the gang had left him, lying sprawled beside the bed, duct tape still attached to his lower face. The police were immediately called and the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crimes Unit arrived on scene straight away. A blue and white forensics tent was erected outside the entrance of the property, while shocked neighbours looked on. I was really worried because no one had a clue what was going on. The police all came at once, but some of us asked what was going on, and they did help calm us down, one of his anxious neighbours told reporters on scene. Others who lived in the same property as Vishal told investigators that they had heard shouting and what sounded like a fight in the early hours of the morning, but didn't investigate the disturbance as they assumed someone was having a lover's quarrel. After the results of the coroner's examination conclusively indicated that he had been beaten over the head and strangled, an official murder investigation got underway. Detective Inspector Justine Jenkins, who was the head investigator for the Major Crimes Unit, spoke to the press on scene. With a look of grit and determination on her face, she told the reporters, "Our thoughts are with Vishal's family and friends at this extremely difficult time. Specialist officers are supporting his family, and I would ask for their privacy to be respected. Our investigations are continuing to establish the circumstances of Vishal's death, and we are appealing for anyone with information to please come forward." It wouldn't take Detective Inspector Jenkins and her team long to track down their first suspect. Using his telephone records, text messages, internet history, and utilising the wealth of CCTV in the area, detectives had zeroed in on Georgia within days. Once detectives had the 23-year-old in custody and access to her phone, what they discovered would blow the case wide open. Georgia's iPhone didn't just contain the damning messages between her and the victim and the call logs with her co-conspirators. She had also made numerous voice notes seemingly addressed to Faith, and Faith had also replied in kind with an apparent attempt to get their story straight. What follows is a transcript of those recordings. The first is from Georgia. "Faith, you need to make sure you wipe your phone. They're not gonna call us murderers for wiping our phones. It's better safe than sorry. You need to wipe it. You have to wipe that phone, Faith, because right now it's a waiting game, Faith. Like, you could get nabbed at any time, bro, and it will happen at 6 a.m. And murder people, they come for you at 6 a.m. 5 and 6 a.m, you have to be prepared for that. Your story must not change. We didn't know he was dead. When I tried to peek, I was intimidated by my man." The following transcript is a voice message from Faith. "When the drug dealers came, like, I opened the door for them, and I don't understand. They were doing the transaction or whatever, but the next thing you know, he ended up in the bedroom and the door was closed and that was it. Like, I didn't see anything after that. The guys, I heard them saying, we're going. They left, but we heard police sirens, so we're assuming that, something must have happened. There was already help on the way, so we left." Detective Inspector Justine Jenkins and the rest of the investigators from the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crimes Unit moved swiftly into action, and in days they had all 6 of their suspects in custody. Under interrogation, all of them remained tight-lipped, only answering questions with a scowl and a grunt of no comment. Each strongly denied the charges until the trial got underway at St Albans Crown Court 7 months later. Faced with the overwhelming and damning evidence against her, Georgia and a little later Tevin as well finally admitted to their parts in the father of two's murder and changed their pleas to conspiracy to rob and manslaughter. The rest of the gang soon began turning on each other. Prosecutor Charlotte Newell QC opened the trial dramatically by stating to the jury, the female defendants created a honey trap. They promised him a sexual liaison that never happened. It allowed them to give entry to the 3 male defendants so they could burst in and take Vishal Gohel unawares and steal property from him. 22-year-old Brandon told the court in Hertfordshire that he had only gone along to the crime with the aim of stealing from Vishal. He told a packed courtroom that Georgia had set up the entire robbery. He stated she was talking about a male she met online, and they were going to go there for some sort of sex party. He was divorced. My understanding was that Mr. Gohel was going to be occupied with the females while we were stealing. He then said he had tried to save Vishal's life, telling the jury, he was on his left side, lying on the floor by the bed. I believe he was unconscious. I tried to perform CPR on Mr. Gohel. Brandon, Sakine, Faith and Tiana pleaded not guilty to murder. One of the key pieces of evidence was the coroner's report of Vishal's injuries, which the prosecution laid out to the jury in every brutal detail. Both sides of his face were injured. There was internal bruising to his scalp, eyes and jaw. There was brain damage and his voice box had been fractured, consistent with squeezing of the neck. He was ambushed in a group attack in his own home. No attempts had been made to contact the emergency services, but there had been efforts had been made to clean the flat. He was dead or dying when they left the flat. There was no attempt to provide assistance to him. After a lengthy trial in December of 2023, the jury had finally reached their decisions. The judge, Richard Foster, summed up the whole crime in a single sentence when he told them as they anxiously awaited their verdicts. The facts of this case are as tragic as they are sordid. What began as a sordid little enterprise ended up as a tragedy. Georgia Bruce Annan and Tevin Leslie were convicted of murder and conspiracy to rob and received a life sentence each, with a minimum term of 26 years each and a 10-year sentence for the robbery charge to run concurrently. Tevin's cousin, Sakine Gordon, also received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. He also received extra prison time for carrying a concealed weapon and the robbery charge. Brandon Brown was cleared of murder but was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years, plus an additional 8 years to run concurrently for conspiracy to rob. Faith Hoppy was sentenced to serve 8 years in prison for manslaughter, with another 8 years for robbery. The youngest, 20-year-old Tiana Edward Hancock, was cleared of all charges and released. Vishal's Aunt Bonnie addressed the criminals in an emotional closing statement. She said, "It was painful to see the total lack of remorse shown by any one of you. You were the last things he saw as he begged for his life. We are appalled by the casual way the crime was committed." After the verdict was reached, the gang were led away to start their sentences behind bars. Detective Inspector Justine Jenkins told reporters outside the court, "I am pleased that justice has been done and these evil individuals have been convicted of this brutal killing. My thoughts remain with the family and friends of Mr. Gohel, who miss his presence in their lives every day. I hope the guilty verdicts give them some peace at last. We quickly found evidence of a honey trap where the woman had gained access on the promise of sexual liaisons that never happened. They then let their male accomplices in to steal property. But this wasn't just a robbery. Mr. Gohel, who had visited a local cash point and shop earlier that night, was brutally killed. He must have been terrified and would undoubtedly have suffered during the brutal attack that killed him. No attempt was made to phone an ambulance. Vishal was simply looking for some companionship that night, during a time of extreme hardship and isolation. He let them into his home because he wanted to trust them, and he was murdered so brutally for such a small amount as £200 and a smartwatch. We at Truly Criminal want to close this podcast exclusive with a statement that Vishal's mother made to the press just after the verdict was reached in St Albans, as we feel it really encapsulates everything that needs to be said about him. Our beloved son Vishal was just 44 years old when he was brutally murdered. He was in the prime of his life. He was a father and best friend to his 2 wonderful boys. He was also a son, grandson, brother and friend. He was a wonderful father, and the damage caused to his young boys by this heinous crime is indescribable. We are a very close and joyful family. We did everything together. Vishal was an integral part of our family. Now we have been pitched in a deep pit of grief, doubt and fear. No matter how many years these criminals spend in prison, nothing will make up for our loss. But we are heartened to know that our justice system works. We hope this will be an example to other young people that crime never pays, that the only way to achieve your dreams is through hard work, diligence and perseverance, just as our beloved Vishal did.